How do we see the world and understand it? Well, we see it bit by bit. We gather one impression here, another impression there, and then after a while, as the impressions pile up, we see patterns that become our view of the world. But the world is complex, our brains are limited, and there's only so much we can grok. If only there was a way to step back, have access to millions more facts about the world than we ourselves can experience, and get a broader, truer, more holistic view of what's going on out there. Well, unique to all species, humans can actually do that by getting data, organizing data, and analyzing data at scale. It's true that our brains are not great at figuring out large numbers, but we are smart enough to build tools that do that job for us. Now, dangers remain in this process. We can use data selectively to make false narratives seem real, and we can also get carried away by the illusion of control that data gives us. We may think we understand, but we never quite understand fully. And we may begin to think that we can control the world and tweak it like a godlike engineer. And that hubris can lead to terrible outcomes. Having said that though, I'd rather have more good data than less. For a democracy to work, citizens need to have access to knowledge. That is why I say never take numbers lightly. The numbers are us.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. When I was in Bangalore last month recording 9 episodes over a couple of weeks, I asked myself, what should my Republic Day episode be? I knew I'd have an episode releasing on the 26th of Jan, so why not do a special? And then I figured that I should record it with Rukmini S. Rukmini is an outstanding data journalist who has been on the show twice before. In our first episode a few years ago, she spoke about her life and gave a masterclass on journalism. She then wrote a fabulous book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, which revealed a lot of counterintuitive truths about our country. Then she came on The Seen and the Unseen again to talk about the book. And after that episode, she started Data for India, which uses data to understand this country better. Some of the insights the organization has come up with are mind-blowing, and thus a fitting way to take stock of our republic. Her work throws light on every important aspect of our economy and society: work, women, health, fertility, the law, and it also brings these numbers to life with deep nuanced stories. In this episode, Rukmini tells me about numbers that moved her, filled her with awe, surprised her, taught her. I loved this conversation, I learned a lot from it, and I'm sure you'll like it too. But before we get to it, let's take a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their Daily Reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees. 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Up-level yourself. Rukmini, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks for having me. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. Both my previous episodes with you were eye-opening for me. And in between those two episodes, you wrote a book. And in between the second episode and now, you've started this great website, Data for India. And you've been up to a lot of really interesting work, which we'll talk about in some detail in this episode. But first, tell me, what has this intervening in between been like? Because when we last spoke, I don't think you mentioned Data for India even as a glimmer in your head at that time, though it might well have been. But what have you been up to? What has driven you? What's life been like?
It wasn't a glimmer in my head. I mean, I think the way I had got to, and yeah, I really think that our episodes were around these pretty life-changing moments, at least career-wise for me, which is prior to the pandemic, I was first a newsroom reporter and then a freelance journalist. And then I think the pandemic changed the way people thought about data a little bit and definitely changed, I think, the sort of atmosphere of interest in different ways of talking about data, and allowed me also some space to experiment and think differently. And then I think that did, in a way, lead to thinking around the book, all of these things that I didn't feel like I had in me. And then, so the second time I spoke to you was after the book had just come out. I don't think I really had a plan. I think I planned to continue doing freelance stuff after that. But the book did well, and so there was a fair amount of it led to a lot of conversations. I traveled with it a lot. I spoke all over the place and at a lot of universities with a lot of younger people. And I think so then, there was the opportunity to have a think about what I wanted to do next and what is it that I wanted to solve for. And I don't think I had ever thought about building something. That maybe some of that self-belief also came as a result of the book. And I had always thought that the trajectory for data journalists was to do more and more ambitious stuff. So if you try to raise money, if you want to build something, the idea is to raise money to build more beautiful and more ambitious stuff. So maybe it is more ambitious from a tech perspective or a design perspective, or you have multiple people working with you. And it took a while to figure out that what I wanted to do was not more ambitious stuff, but less ambitious stuff, which is I wanted to tell the really 101 stuff. And the other thing was the realization that what I wanted to do was not journalism. I wanted to talk about numbers and communicate them to people and allow people to understand the country better through numbers. But I wanted to move away from newsrooms and from journalism as such. So I think that the period after the book allowed me to figure out that in some ways I felt that it was a feeling of me and the others in my profession that the insights from the book surprised people as much as they did, because I feel like if all of us had been doing our jobs well enough, it would not have been such a big surprise to people. And I think there was a certain humility that I had to contend with around the fact that data journalism had only gone so far and maybe could only go so far. And that what needed building was public goods, things that are not ephemeral, that are longer lasting, things that involve building knowledge and resources and not news that necessarily has to be quote unquote new, and to build the end-to-end system that doesn't force fact-checking on people, but allows those who want to look at the underlying data themselves in a way that our current models of journalism don't seem to allow. So yeah, all of that sort of took a while to coalesce. What I was thinking of was actually the opposite direction to what I really wanted to do. And once it did come together, it's just been a continuous sense of this is the right thing. This is what I'm meant to do. This is what I want to do. This is what I love to do. And this is what actually feels like it needs solving, and that I know how to do it. So that's been pretty sweet.
I see two kinds of evolution here, and I want to ask you about both of them. And one is a kind of life that you've flown into, there's a beautiful essay by Henrik Carlson. Have you read Henrik Carlson? He's a great Substacker. There's a beautiful, beautiful essay he's written, which I forward to many people because I think if I had read it in my 20s, it could have changed my life. It's that kind of excellent piece. Link it from the show notes, where he talks about how one mistake many people make when they're envisaging a life for themselves
themselves or a partner for themselves or whatever, is that they have a certain sense of what is that life like which they want to live, or what is that partner like they want to be with, and then they go out and they look for that. And what he points out is that sometimes it is better that instead of going out and looking for it and trying to fit yourself into that frame which you have decided is good for you, that you let life happen to you. Whatever is not in your comfort zone, you push it away. Whatever is in your comfort zone, you let it flow around you. And eventually, he says, you will find a life that is perfect for you, that fits you. The life fits you instead of you trying to fit an artificial notion of a life that is out there. And he says, in fact, his partner also he met like that. And he says that everything about this life, or a lot about this life, will be very different from what you imagine for yourself, but it will fit you perfectly, which ties in with what you're saying about you never imagined when you were a journalist that you would be doing this. But it seems to me, in a sense, that you kind of flowed into this, and today your life fits you in a way that your previous life probably didn't, even though you fit what you anticipated for yourself. So one question is about this life, that do you feel that that has happened, that you're finally doing something where everything is natural and authentic to you and it makes complete sense? And the other evolution also is about the sense of purpose. Like when you are a journalist, there is a certain sense of purpose that good journalists have, whether it is fidelity to the truth or finding out, telling human stories or whatever the case may be. And I'm guessing that there was some purpose there for you, but that kind of morphed into this larger sense of purpose, that it is not about telling stories, but about building these public goods, as it were, enabling other people to examine their own stories and find the stories they want to tell within this world of data that you're beginning to build. So take me through both of these. Like one, that notion of the life that you're living, where is it like a coming, in a sense, purpose is a part of this, that is it a coming together of something that you believe you should be doing and care about, and a melding of that with stuff that you're good at, and the life just fits you?
Yeah, I think that did happen to some extent, and I think there are enormous privileges involved in being able to wait for that life to fit you, right? And I feel like a recipient of all of those. So I don't think that that's equally doable or possible for everyone, and I do feel lucky about it. I was talking to a friend the other day about a few years ago, I would never have imagined that I could run a company from home, right? I work next door to home. We're fully remote. We're 10 people, but we're fully remote. And I love that for so many reasons. I love that when I meet someone great who I want to hire, I don't have to ask them to upend their lives and move to a city that's not for everyone. I'm happy with my life in Chennai, but it's not for everyone. I don't have to make anyone do that. I love that I'm home every day when my kids come home from school. It feels like the ultimate privilege in a way that generations before me have. There's a word in Marathi that is tadfad, which is what it sounds like. The tadfad of working women who wanted to be there at home, but it wasn't all. It just feels inordinately lucky to be there. And I was telling this friend that so my mother worked all her working years and would do exactly this tadfad of trying to reach home reasonably by 5 or so, and to not be hurtling down Pune streets on a Luna as she was every evening to try to get home in time, just feels amazing. And my friend was saying, we both are former journalists, that when she was taking the 908 local to Churchgate every morning, we thought this was our lives. I lived in Bombay. My first job was in Bombay. So I feel like there's always been a sense of putting one foot in front of the other. And that foot was onto a local train at 9:08 in the morning. And I had not envisioned anything different. So I do think I had envisioned a future in newsrooms, which got appended for reasons that were not all of my own choice. I don't know if I told you about this, but when I didn't leave newsrooms completely voluntarily. It was because I had had my first child and I didn't want to go back to full-time in office work. I wanted to work full-time, but not full-time in an office. And that just wasn't on offer that back then, because this was just pre-pandemic. So that was why I left a regular newsroom job, which I may not have ever done. I may have been putting one foot in front of the other, not onto a train, but somewhere else in maybe on Chennai's trains for the next 20 or 30 years. I don't know if this route would have ever happened. And I think another thing that's really important is, to me, self-belief came much later and came with age. And it's been good to be able to sit with some confidence, self-belief, the opposite of imposter syndrome in some ways, that I can do this is for me. Other people believing in me is not something I should be surprised by this, so for me all of that came with age, but also serendipitously. So much of this is serendipitous, and so much of it is other people's belief in me as well. So I don't know if I told you about this, but with the book, the idea for the book came from Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who wrote me an email once to say, you've written all these pieces, you've written once about education, you've written once about crime, you should put them together and write a book about 10 things about India. And the fact that Pratap Bhanu Mehta would think that there's a book in me was like all the propelling I needed at the time. So yeah, life happened to me, but also other people's beliefs and my own self-belief happened to me that allowed me to get to this place. And about purpose, yeah, I do think I've always had a sense of it. But a few things changed. One is I did grow quite disillusioned with Indian journalism, and the confidence that my role or my place in Indian journalism was going to continue to let me do the kind of work I wanted to do was not there, even though even today, the greatest stories about this country come from Indian journalism and from Indian journalists. So I watched the movie Homebound recently, which I loved. And Homebound is based on a reported article by Basharat Peer, who wrote it for the New York Times. But if you remember the sheer range and power of Indian journalism during the pandemic, it's a glorious chapter. If you talk about golden ages, it is a glorious chapter in journalism anywhere, what Indian journalists did in the pandemic. But my confidence in newsroom serving the purpose of expanding public understanding in a long-lasting way through data did wane a little bit. And yeah, I think the sense of purpose I now have is around a few things. It is around the sense that we need to give people better tools for them to make sense of their own worlds, and not just the worlds that we are telling them about. That's one. Then I think perhaps to some extent the charm of storytelling has worn off a little bit for me. The concern that these are sometimes flourishes in the way of a more direct truth. It does worry me. For example, I don't think I've put on the TV in like 2 years. It's just, I read and I read almost exclusively fiction. So it's not that entirely, but the desire to use storytelling as a device to get this information across, that's withered a little bit. And I also think I have, which I hadn't expected, a strong sense of purpose around building a good and kind organization. So again, I have only ever worked for very large corporations. The opportunity to build an organization that doesn't have a number of days of leave in the year, for example, it's just nice to be able to do that. So I definitely have a sense of purpose around being a place that people enjoy working at as well.
The last time that we recorded, I remember you pointing out one particular facet of storytelling which you had become cynical about, which is starting a data story with an anecdote at the start to reflect some part of the data. And you pointed out that it'll just become almost a cliche in a sense, and you could cherry pick any part of the data and tell an anecdote. What does it even mean, etc., etc. Can you double click on what you meant by when you said that your belief in the power of the newsroom was waning? Why was it waning? Because people who still believe in it would say that no, journalism, truth to power, etc., etc., is still a vital function. So why was it waning? Where do you feel the fault lines were? Is it that in the modern narrative battles, the truth could never, win out so easily anyway? Or did the whole exercise of storytelling seem too cynical, that why do we have to sell the truth? The truth should be able to speak for itself. So just elaborate on, the waning of that belief.
So I think my belief in the power of individuals in Indian newsrooms remains very strong, but the feeling that these are organizations built advance knowledge is the part that's waning. So it really feels that feels like good people, waving their fists at the wind, and it seems. Yeah, most of my friends are journalists who work in newsrooms at enormous personal cost, risk, all of that. And forget my friends, there's the entire universe of journalists out there, particularly out of big cities and not in English newsrooms. But as with many institutions, these are institutions in real existential danger, and their ability as institutions to carry forward democratic principles is what seems really in question to me right now. So I didn't doubt my ability to do a half decent job of data journalism, but the ability of these places being places that could institutionally carry this information forward in a way that was meaningful, with integrity, and genuinely made to advance knowledge as its main focus, that I can't stand behind anymore. So that is about the institutions. About the storytelling part, I still feel very conflicted. When I go back, if I ever have to, I try to avoid rereading my book. I cannot think of a greater example of narcissism than reading your own book. Maybe quoting it to others might be one of those. But when I go, the parts that I still can't not cringe at at some of the stories in it, because I do know that those are devices. They are stories that have stayed with people. People still do talk to me about it, though not universally. It's not the case that for most people it's the stories that stood out and not the insights from the data. It may not be the individual number that remains with people. And even now, when we write, me or my colleagues, I tell them that what I would want someone, when they finish reading a piece, is not necessarily to remember a number in it, but to remember the insight. And that, I think, so I don't mind if people don't remember the stories or don't remember the numbers. If what they remember is the insight, that's what we're trying to do. So yeah, when I reread the book, I still feel very conflicted about the stories in it. Now, when I read other bits of social science work by others, I can just see the instrumentalization of stories there, and it's all a bit. It's like, when you can, what is that, suspension of disbelief, when that happens to you in a movie, you just can't enjoy it anymore, right? When that breaks. I feel like that's happened to me with stories and social science now, that I can see that instrumentalization, and so I just can't be swept away by it anymore. Even with quality data journalism, I still see it used there. I just wish it wasn't there.
Can you make it concrete for me with an example of a story, number, insight? Maybe from your book or from your work, but a story, a number, and an insight where, maybe you don't like the way you did the story anymore or whatever, but you felt the insight was really key.
Yeah, so let me give you an example about demographics, which I talk about quite a lot. I have a story in the book that's about sort of a changing family, and it has to do with the stories about a Muslim family, and how through the generations, things like access to education have improved substantially, and age at marriage has gone further. When I talk about data on birth rates and how things have changed over time, there are all these relative numbers, right, about the relative share of children in the population. To me, I feel like the insight that, and this is where you really start to realize that if people don't know this, then communication has been failing for a while. The child population, India's absolute child population in numbers, has been falling since the early 2000s. We've had fewer children every year since then. I was talking to someone today about school enrollments, and they were saying, how surprising it is, or what a mystery it is that school enrollment is falling in some parts of the country. We have fewer children. We are not oriented to a new reality where we now have fewer children every day. You have to start getting used to seeing fewer and fewer children around you. So, whether or not you remember what the numbers are, what the relative proportion is, if this aspect of a reorienting country has not come through to people, that's something I would want them to take away. That we've got to get used to a country now where children are not the age group you're most likely to see around you. You're more likely to see older adults than you are to see children. And yeah, that's the insight I would want people to take away.
Yeah, and in your essays for Data for India, you have a bunch of these factoids which I didn't know, like the number of babies peaking at about 29 million at the turn of the million, and that 1 in 3 children in India today are in Bihar and UP, which kind of blew my mind. I also want to double click on another aspect of your work. Like, if one looks at your work from an outside, it would immediately seem that you're a doer. You're a person of high agency. Because COVID happened, you did that daily podcast. You did some more than 100. At the time I recorded my first episode with you, I remember listening to more than 100 episodes of your podcast up till that point. And of course, it continued after that. Then you went and wrote your book. Then you built this organization, which is actually like 20 tasks in one. It's like a mammoth thing to just build an organization. It's a whole different ball game. So from the outside, it might seem as if you're a high agency person, you're a doer. And, I realize people say that sometimes about me also, and I feel like it couldn't be further from the truth, because there are like 50, 60 things I want to do, and there are so many things I'm excited about. And it so happens that circumstances fall into place and one or two of them happen, but they just happen to happen. And I'm like, no, I seem very active and productive, but that's not the full story. So what is it with you? Have you always been this high agency person who's got an idea and then you're going out and doing it? Or did circumstances conspire in each of these happening? How does it work out?
I do think circumstances conspired. I think I really would have been I would have pictured a much more linear path for myself. I feel like, journalism felt like what I was going to do. But yeah, maybe I'm not giving myself enough credit, because even within journalism, I did move from being a field reporter to data journalism, which at that time was fairly nascent. And then, when I moved to the Hindu, we set up its new data journalism sort of vertical at the time. Yeah, I feel like other people's belief in me has been a bigger driver. I also think that to be able to do the things that I do, like, to be able to travel so much with the book as I did, or even to be able to travel now and talk about Data for India stuff, means that there is a village that's, helping me keep all of this going. So, I think being continuously held up and supported and told that you should keep doing more and put your hand up for this, go for that, it'll be fine. Again, I'm not sure if, and not just go, but I've got it. That all of that is going to be taken care of. It makes for a happy person. First of all, you're not just doing the stuff, you're doing it happily. You're able to throw yourself fully into it. So yeah, I think I've been really propelled by many others.
tell me about the fiction you've been reading. You mentioned you only read fiction. Now, people would not imagine this of someone like you who's been a data journalist who wrote a non-fiction book using data, who's running data for India. So tell me not just about the kind of fiction you read, but what is the role that it plays in your life? Why is it that you only read fiction? What's your interior life like? Because, you're not just numbers, numbers, numbers.
I would imagine that like there is an imaginable answer to this, which is that I read that, and this is not the answer, but the imaginable answer would be that I read a lot of fiction about, say, India, and that helps me color in the stuff that I see in the numbers. And I read a fair amount of Indian fiction. I just read Rahul Bhattacharya's Real Song, which I liked very much, and that sort of suitable boy space I enjoy very much, which is the sort of modern Indian story. But I actually have a particularly weird preference, which is I read almost exclusively Sri Lankan fiction. 2 years ago, I went to Sri Lanka for the first time on holiday, and my friend Meera Srinivasan is the Hindu's correspondent there. Excellent journalist and a sweet girl, a good friend. And so on my return, she gave me a book by Shyam Selvadurai, which is called Many Roads Through Paradise. And it's an edited anthology around Sri Lanka. I think it's all fiction and there's some poetry as well. And it seems so strange for an edited anthology to be life-changing. I mean, it's one of the best books I've ever read. First of all, I fell in love with Shyam Selvadurai, who is,
I've only read Funny Boy by him, which is such a beautiful.
Yeah, I love it. I developed a huge literary crush on Shyam Selvadurai. The very prospect of him being at literary festivals that I might go to stresses me out so much that then I don't go. But I love that book, and it led me to read many of the books anthologized in it. So, and in some ways, this is not particularly novel, because there is great fiction that has come out of Sri Lanka, and many people would have many Sri Lankan books as their favorites. But so I did a couple of things. First of all, I have a preference for, I don't enjoy what I call bro writing, and there's a certain bro style that some leading Sri Lankan, they're very good books, but they're a bit bro. So I don't read those. Then I try not to read too much diasporic writing.
Writing that's full of itself.
That a little bit, but it's also very male forward. There are some Indian writers as well. I don't enjoy it very much. It's brash and it's attractive in its own way, but it's not for me. So that rules out a few. Then I tried to avoid diasporic writing for as long as I could. Although some of the best known Sri Lankan writers don't live in Sri Lanka, including Shyam Selvadurai now. So I did read some diasporic stuff later, but I avoided it as much as I could. So I ended up reading a lot that was translated, a lot that was older, because a lot of the newer stuff is either bro or diasporic. And this is the thing, for a country of that size, it has produced in 3 languages such outstanding literature that for 2 years I've read almost nothing else, and I'm still going. The book on my Kindle right now is from the 80s. It's also a Sri Lankan book. It's called When Memory Dies by A. Shivanandan, and I have a few more lined up. My son's favorite writer is a Sri Lankan children writer, so there's also children's fiction. Yeah, so, and once I started that, I found that I couldn't read anything else, so I've read almost nothing else for the last 2 years.
Do you also write fiction? Have you tried writing fiction?
I haven't. No, I don't think I'd be very good. I wrote extremely self-conscious stuff when I was in school and college, and then I don't write fiction.
Tell me about how the idea for Data for India came about. Like, why did you think it was necessary, and why did you think you have to do it?
So, as I said, I felt that my first instinct was to try and do more and more ambitious data journalism. And when I tried to think about what it was that I was trying to solve there, the only answer boiled down to it did seem to be narcissism, essentially, which is, I want to tell bigger and more exciting things. But when I try to sit with, well, what do I think is needed, or what do I need to solve for? The answer was that with the book as well, I had come to the conclusion that most people do not have an idea of the country that is based in fact, and most of this is a result of poor communication of Indian data. This is for two reasons. One is that this data is very hard to access. And then the second is that the people communicating it aren't doing a very good job for a couple of different reasons. I felt that we had now got to a place where access to that data had improved tremendously. So that first part could be solved, especially with working with tech. And the second part, I felt that my experience within while working as a data journalist equipped me to do that better. So what we wanted to do was to set up something where if two people are having an argument in a bar about something to do with Indian data, they should be able to do something else other than, Google it or ask ChatGPT. If they want to come somewhere to answer that question for themselves, whether it's just trying to solve a bet in a bar, or whether it is because they're doing research for something they're writing about, there should be somewhere where you can come to answer questions that you have about India through the data. It should be enjoyable to read. It should be simple and speak to people who don't necessarily work with numbers. It should be nicely visualized, and the data behind it should be available for download as well, so that people can work with it if they want to. And most importantly, I felt like that there was very poor and opaque writing about data and data sources. And that had in part led to a great suspicion and distance between people, especially younger people, and Indian data, where there had reached this point where many people felt that there was either no good data about India or no data that you could trust about India. And the cause of a lot of that was how little people communicated how Indian data was collected, the methodology, and what it all meant. So the idea was not just to engage with what are the things that the data tells us, but also with the data itself. How is it collected? And what does it all mean? We are hugely inspired by Our World in Data, which is that's what we aspire to be, but it's a platform set up by the economist Max Ruser. And I think what Our World in Data did is that it, first of all, it's the most reliable destination for data from the developing world in particular, or the broader global picture. But for them, it also helped set and amend global aid priorities. I mean, that was in part what they feed into. We are not entering the aid debate, but we feel that anybody making decisions around India and its challenges should also be able to have a reliable resource that they're able to come to. So we are, hugely inspired by data, by Our World in Data, and in many ways ask ourselves sometimes, what would Ovid do? How would Ovid do it? We've talked to them as well. So yeah, that was the idea, to build. People tell their students all the time. Earlier they would say, don't go to Wikipedia. Now they might say, don't ask ChatGPT. You should be able to tell them where to go. Then it shouldn't just be about don't go here and don't go there. Of course, ChatGPT and others use our work as well. So I don't think it's one or the other. But and you want to be a credible destination, but you don't want to be a credible destination because you're calling yourselves credible. The reason should be that you can see where the data comes from. You can see that non-partisanship is something that's truly, genuinely important to us. And you can see how the data itself is collected and what it all means.
And how much of a bottleneck is that sources of data in India are poor, untrustworthy, not so many, etc., etc. I mean, I'm sure if we've spoken about this in our past 2 episodes also, I don't remember. But how do you get past this challenge, especially in these times where the government has clamped down on some sources of data, other sources of data may or may not be reliable. Many things aren't being measured at all. Like we have no very little sense directly of how the informal economy is doing, or say what the impact of demon on that was, or what the impact of COVID was, etc., etc. So many things can't be measured, and so many things that are measured, you still don't know whether you can trust the numbers because of who the sources are. So what was your thinking about this? How did you get past this? And is it even true? Like, how bad is it? How good is it? How do you handle this? Because before you can be credible, the underlying data has to be credible.
So I actually think that this is a bit overstated. And my issue is that there is data that we should have problems with, but we need to be pretty specific about that instead of this broad brush, Indian data is not good enough or is not trustworthy. So let's talk about the not good enough part first. There are things that aren't being measured well enough, and I would say health, to my mind, is a particularly bad area. I think actually the economic data part is a bit overstated and overblown. It's perhaps not as high frequency as one would want, but again, just to be a bit more realistic about where we are as a country, where we are economically as a country, the size of the informal sector, and then what the data does do. I think the problem is overstated over here. Other data sets that were produced earlier that aren't anymore. The census is delayed. It's going to come out next year now. That's a notable example. But apart from that, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to call out data specifically that's being clamped down upon by the government. Now, there is often there are delays. There is every government, I think, doesn't want data that shows them in a bad light to come out. So there is always that tension. But overall, in fact, I feel like the reason I'm able to do what I do and the reason we're able to set this up is because access to data has improved so dramatically in the last 10 years. And what's changed over time is that this isn't privileged access anymore. So it isn't that unit level data from the big surveys is available to like a select group of academic institutions. It's freely, universally available on, government websites. Then there is the untrustworthy part. And this to me is, it irritates me particularly because what is not trustworthy, to figure that out, needs work. And it feels like a far easier and lazier way to talk about the data by calling all of it untrustworthy and then encouraging everybody to not engage with it in this sort of cynical hand-waving way. So where there are issues with the data, so for example with GDP estimation, there are questions about about the methodology used, about different time series. The people who engage with it do the hard work of figuring out what has changed and what's problematic, and then talk specifically about that, and that makes sense. We are not in Banana Republic territory where X data is being collected, we don't know where it came from, someone is able to manipulate it. That is not the zone we are in, even though that's often how the data is talked about. We have had a supervisory system around Indian data right from the 50s onwards, which means that there are checks and balances both within the country, and there is huge international scrutiny and supervision norms for Indian data. So I think untrustworthy is an unfair characterization, and I think it takes a lot more work to figure out where there are problems with the data. It's rewarding to do that because there is then the actual opportunity to engage with making things better. And I really wish more people did that, and less people chose to sort of, defect away and either choose to use private data only, or just stop engaging with Indian data with this sort of assumption that none of it can be trusted.
I guess if you're an armchair observer, it's easy to make the generalization that it's untrustworthy. And of course, if parts of it are untrustworthy, you can just paint it all with a broad brush and say it's untrustworthy. But if you actually want to do the hard yards and gain some legibility into the country, then you have to engage with it, which is kind of what you did.
No, and I also think that there has been damage done by not enough writing and explanation around methodology. And I think this has had a really far-reaching damaging effect. So so for example, the fact that so many people think that surely, fuddy-duddy old-fashioned Indian labor statistics can't possibly cover jobs in the new economy. Like surely there's no category that says Uber driver, they mustn't cover it at all. So I think if more people knew how labor statistics were captured, people would feel less, find it all less trustworthy. So, for example, questions about work in India are open-ended questions. What did you do for most of the whatever? And then these trained enumerators have to encode it into different categories, which means that no matter what you did, there is a way it can be coded and captured in Indian statistics. So, is it captured at the level of granularity that we would want? Has someone grouped it into a column saying, app-based aggregator driver? Maybe not. But is it all captured? Yes, very much so. And then if people feel suspicious about the numbers saying, how can they say that, work is at, employment is at whatever, because these numbers surely don't capture Uber, Zomato, whatever. It is a failure of being able to explain numbers. And I think that's one of the reasons we are so big on methodology, because we feel that poor explanation of methodology has fed into this atmosphere of suspicion around Indian data that a lot of young people in particular seem to feel.
And looking at your website, you can correct me or add to this if I'm wrong, but it feels like there are three broad things that I could see you doing. And one is that you just bring all of the data there and make it accessible and easy to browse and all of that. And that's part one. Part two is you use the data to generate insights, and you're building stories and you're building charts, and some of it a lot like what the best data journalism would do, but also beyond that. And the third is that you are also sort of, in one of your pages, you talk about how you're trying to deepen data literacy. And it seems that the third thing you're trying to do is present it all in language that is simple and clear. Like when I was going through some of your stories, I noted that the structure is, so beautiful that, sometimes I'll ask ChatGPT on a difficult subject, explain it to me like I'm 12. And I think actually your website, and this is a huge compliment, can be read by someone who's 12. You've got the summation right at the top. What are you trying to do? Like you had a beautiful piece on anemia, and that's such a good explainer. You have that one-liner at the top, then what is anemia, and you have 2-3 paras there, and then you just dig deeper and deeper. The language is crystal clear, the sentences are crisp, and also on the left-hand side, you had a chapter by chapter thing where you can click on each of those chapters. And obviously, to make it so simple, there's a lot of thought that has gone behind it, and I want to double click on each of these aspects, as it were. But is this reading broadly correct, that these are the sort of three things that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the guiding principle, that this stuff should not be work for the readers. This is the work that we need to put in for it to be extremely simple for readers to. I think there's often this almost sort of virtuous tone that comes into how people do data journalism or even talk about it, which is, it's hard for people to understand numbers, but almost like this is something you need to do, or this is like a bitter pill you need to swallow. And we just feel like it should not be hard. If it's hard, we're either not going to put it in, or we're going to simplify it, or only talk about it to a level of complexity that's sort of layperson friendly, because I don't think we should be making it as much hard work as so many people do. I'd add one fourth element to it, which is the engagement with the data sources themselves. So I guess that's part of the data literacy aspect, but it's also the let's understand these data sets and where they come from. And, not just let's understand it, but let's critically engage with them, because there are multiple pieces that we've written about issues with data collection. And we'd be very happy to be part of the solution. And we feel like part of the solution is critically engaging with these. Are they asking the right questions? Are they measuring them in the right way? Is there something that could be done better?
So let's double click into each of these aspects. Like, you're collating a lot of data from different sources, right? And so what's the thinking behind how to make it intelligible? What is that particular challenge like?
So we have a pretty conservative bar on what we use as data. So we use public data only, and there the idea is that that the reader should have the same amount of access to that data that we do, even if the onus is not on the reader to do the same work with the data that we did. But that whole line, they should be able to draw it themselves. We also typically work in India with union government data only, because we don't think that state government data is at a level of, data integrity and quality that we're confident of working with. Data from Indian surveys, particularly the National Sample Survey, conforms to international standards. They're signatories to various conventions, and so it meets those standards. And then we work with data from multilateral agencies like the World Bank and others. So we're pretty conservative with our data sources. There is a fair amount of work that's first needed on, bringing in the data, cleaning it, that aspect of it. And then I think the choice of what to talk about and how to talk about it, I think there some of our background in data journalism, which a few of us in the team have, does help. Because I think one of the things that journalism gives you is a God complex, where you feel divinely ordained to write about things that are interesting to you, without once worrying about whether they're interesting to other people. I think that has spilled over into our work as well, where the choice of what aspects to write about is not debilitating. There is quite a large amount of clarity about what we want to write about, which comes from just our sense of, here are things that we find interesting and think that others will find interesting as well. So I, fully prepared to accept that these calls are subjective, but hopefully come from some experience and hopefully resonate with people. If they don't, I'm sure we'll hear from people in the future.
So, that's a really interesting point, because one advice that I give to all creators or all would-be podcasters, writers, YouTubers I meet is, don't be externally driven, be internally driven. Like, don't think about what do people want to read, or don't try to second guess what people want, and that's a part to mediocrity. Just follow your own heart, do what you want to do. And that, you're calling that a God complex in the context of the journalist, but at one level, I can't see what option you would have but just to pick what you feel is interesting and hope that other people will share your interests, which all of the time pretty much they will, and you've just got to trust your own judgment on that. At the same time, another way of looking at what you are doing is, it is not only an act of individual creation, it is in a sense a public service. You're building public goods, and therefore you also do have to think about objectively what could be considered important or in the national interest, and etc, etc, etc. So how does one balance that, and what are the kind of choices you've made, if you have any examples at different points of what to do or not do?
Yeah, no, we really do grapple with that a lot. And in some ways, it's down to sometimes a very simplistic division, which is, there's all the stuff that's necessary and important and that we need to talk about. And we have, our long list of foundational basic stuff that you just can't find anywhere right now. And we would want people to be able to come here. We want people to be able to find stuff on malaria, on infant mortality. They should know about what's happening with unemployment. These are all things that should be there. But we're people with individual interests as well, who find niche things that are, interesting to us and that we want to write about. And it's not just me, it's my writers as well, who have particular interests, things that, pop out from the data that they're just itching to write about. And we end up having to strike a balance between the two. So let me give you an example of this, and also I can very smugly give you an example of this because this has been one of our successful experiments here. So we at one point decided we wanted to write a lot more about manufacturing employment. And the reason for that is that there's a fair amount of interest both in India and overseas about what role is manufacturing going to play in India's future. There was maybe a time that we thought that it was going to be the pathway from agriculture. We've seen that that's not happened. There's been a real faltering or stagnation of manufacturing, and it's services that have grown, but these are services that are very labor non-intensive. And so where is labor going to go? All of that is really a huge question. Is this going to be an economic trajectory different from what we've seen elsewhere in the world? The world is interested in that as well. So we started looking at manufacturing employment, and we're always interested in the nitty-gritty, and you can't always get down to it, but eventually we try to. And so there was the question of, what do people do in manufacturing? What are the largest numbers? Like, what is India manufacturing? And it's not just what is India manufacturing, what are people doing? What are people in manufacturing doing? And within that, so one of our writers, Nilina Suresh, she decided she wanted to write about women in manufacturing. And both she and our other writer, Abhishek Wagmare, who was writing about manufacturing in general, she was writing about women in manufacturing. Both of them came up with something called custom tailoring. So both of them said, look, this is a really large thing that we're seeing in the numbers. And when Nilina looked at women in manufacturing, it was particularly large. So what was it? India has this National Industrial Code, which classifies every occupational activity. It goes down to 5 digits. So if you picture, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 is super granular. It is cleaner of windows in hotel. It's super granular. And at that level of granularity, they were finding that custom tailoring was a really huge part of Indian manufacturing. When Nilina finished her piece on women in manufacturing, she said, this custom tailoring thing is really interesting. I said, what, go for it. She was very keen to write about it. And it's ended up being, so it was a strange, we're just in our second year. So maybe what we should be chasing what we should be focusing is on manufacturing in India, full stop, then service sector in India, full stop, and not going down into these rabbit holes. But this did seem promising. And what she's found is that from being one job within manufacturing, custom tailoring to me is almost sort of indistinguishable from the Indian manufacturing stories. 1 in 6 Indian manufacturing workers is a custom tailor. Of the 14 million new jobs added between 2018 and 2024 in manufacturing, so like a big manufacturing sector growth, 6 million of these were in were of custom tailors alone, the majority of them women. So this big increase that we've seen of women in manufacturing is almost entirely driven by custom tailors. Now, if that custom tailoring is a word for large Bangladesh style apparel factories in which women are doing some tailoring, that would be one vision of what Indian manufacturing looks like. These are self-employed people working from the home, largely women. They are not tied to big manufacturers. They are not working on a contract basis with manufacturers. This is really small scale, very low wage, insecure work that a large number of women are doing on the side with other things. So this is what's called subsidiary employment. The oddest part of all of this is that custom tailoring is not a manufacturing activity in economic terms. It's counted as a service sector activity, which makes sense when you really think about custom tailoring. So the majority of women in manufacturing, a large share of Indians in manufacturing, do this job that has now grown to be such a big part of the Indian manufacturing story, and that isn't even counted in manufacturing within India's economic statistics. To us, it just felt like something really interesting, and it was justified by the large numbers. We've been so struck by the way it drove conversation forward. The number of people I've had say to us that now that we know that this is such a big part of the Indian manufacturing story, how can we think differently about women in manufacturing? How can we think differently about custom tailoring? What should the future of this look like? Should we build an app where you're getting build a platform for this? It stopped being an odd, fun thing we found in the data, and it really became a dimension of importance. And I think there, again, that God complex of feeling, hey, I found this interesting and others are going to find it interesting too. That part I'm joking about. I think what it does do, though, is it helps us narrow focus and choose that this is the interesting thing to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about all the things that people do in manufacturing. I'm going to pick this one thing that's a large number, that's a growing share, that says something about the quality and nature of Indian manufacturing, and really crystallize it till it becomes that one point, and it becomes that one phrase. Even I feel like I've heard the phrase custom tailors just much more from people than I had before this. So I feel that was one example of us taking it from something like a textbook thing that you should do of people in manufacturing to something much more narrow and interesting, and it did connect.
No, it's a delightful story. I love this story. And the two questions you spoke about at the start, that instead of asking what is India manufacturing, you chose to ask, but what are people doing? And the second question is profoundly more interesting to me, because the first question, what is India manufacturing, is so banal that even if you have the correct answer, it's of interest only to central planners, and that's a futile part to tread along. But what are people doing is a question that anyone interested in our society, in human nature, should want to know. And it strikes me that then the custom tailoring story really becomes a gateway into understanding people better. Like, what are the kind of further insights you got from that story about Indian society itself? Like in many previous episodes about women's participation in the workforce and all that, one hears about how there is almost like a reverse bell curve, that as families get to a certain level point, the women stop working because it is felt that, okay, the honor of the family demands a woman stay at home. And I guess I would imagine that a lot of the women taking up custom tailoring are doing so because they want to work and they want an income, but they don't want to leave the house. And so that's just one angle which immediately comes to mind, but there are 50 other angles which emerge out of that, like so what are the kind of further insights or areas of inquiry that you got out of this one story, for instance?
Yeah. So I think this aspect of subsidiary work is quite important and interesting, and also a nuance to the women in the labor force story that doesn't get talked about enough, because we sort of tend to think of employment in very binary terms, in terms of being in or out. But there's also this 1 foot in, 1 foot out, which is what subsidiary employment can be. And we feel that custom tailoring is allowing people, women who either cannot or for various reasons don't fully enter the labor force. So it could be that there just isn't the sort of work that they want there, to do some work, and custom tailoring allows for that. We also see that it does mean that the nature of women and men in manufacturing is very different and should not be talked about in the same breath. So for men in manufacturing, it's salaried employment that's an important story, and that is how we typically tend to think of manufacturing work. For women, it's self-employment, and it's largely driven by custom tailoring. If we looked at just the numbers, and if we saw an increase in the manufacturing workforce, if we saw an increase in the number of women in manufacturing, our minds might have turned to the Foxconn model, or the women in textile factories sort of model. But I do think these numbers show us that too is a pretty fringe part of how manufacturing works in India. And if I think about manufacturing, the image that comes to my mind is a woman tailoring in her house in a way that isn't maybe in the strictest sense even manufacturing, right? I mean, national accounts certainly don't seem to think of it in that respect. So that's one. We do see that that wages are very low, also because it is in part subsidiary work. So I think one of the things that we have found is that, and this should be so self or so apparent, but that building narratives based on broad summary statistics is going to take you into very problematic directions. If you look at these numbers and then say, oh, this shows that X state is manufacturing is growing, or that women in manufacturing in Y state are growing, and you're not thinking of it as this sort of home-based work for women who aren't fully in the labor force, you're going to get pretty incorrect prescriptions of what economic activity in those places look like. And you're also going to get a pretty bad sense of where we're going, right? If we see the share of women in manufacturing go on increasing, I don't think it necessarily means the things that we expect it to mean. So it definitely does not mean formal work. All of this is informal work. It does not mean women leaving the house to go to factories. It does not mean connections with the global economy. I think it means that being sort of uncritical cheerleaders sometimes of numbers just rising means that you're missing this whole world of nuance below it.
I'll ask a broader meta question here, and I'm not making an argument, I'm just genuinely asking a question. Who does this data help? Like, what is the use of this data? For example, something that has often struck me about the GDP, apart from the fact that one could argue it measures the wrong things, like it certainly should not measure government spending, but also from the way that it is measured. But quite apart from all of that, I just feel that why do we need to know the GDP? It's only from a central planning mindset that you think the economy is going to be planned in a top-down way, that the GDP is an important figure. But if that is not your mindset, if you realize that societies and economies, flourish in a bottom-up way, it's spontaneous order, then as an individual, I don't need to know this data. I don't need to know what the GDP is. I don't need to know how many women work in manufacturing. I just need to follow my incentives and I need to do what I do. And the path towards fixing the system, towards fixing those structural incentives actually doesn't really have much to do with the numbers. But in a practical sense, I mean, that's a very provocative meta-argument, but in a practical sense, who does the data really help? Like, I get that it helps someone like me who may want to make sense of the country, and some of the data may be useful to me to understand exactly what's going on. But does it really help the state do anything meaningful? Has there been an example you can recall of the state course correcting when they have gotten the right data, or being able to put some policy into motion because the data was correct, etc., etc.?
I do think that does happen a lot. So first of all, data like this, we can come to government changing policy second, but there is a lot of empowered decision making that happens outside government that is heavily driven and influenced by data, and those people getting these narratives wrong is extremely damaging as well. It means that this is philanthropic funding, this is funder priorities, these are even private initiatives around things like say building housing for women workers, dormitories, designing transport. All of that can be based on very problematic data, and can take you in very in decisions that ultimately don't help women if they're going to solve for the wrong thing.
I mean, somebody, like I think you pointed out today, somebody suggested with this custom tailoring thing that why doesn't someone start an urban company for these guys? And someone reading your piece and looking at the data might well immediately think that, wow, we have to do that.
Yeah, no, and also it means that if we've and some of these things are priorities that we just simply borrow from elsewhere, right? So there may be thinking around how Bangladesh has done it or how East Asia has done it, and you might come to the conclusion that what women need is, say, their own two-wheeler to get to work, and that will change things. But if what this data is showing us, for example, is that either women prefer to work from homes because of norms around work and life, or it is that the quality of work that they want doesn't exist out there, and so they're just trying to make do with within the extra time that they have. These would be terribly wrong, decisions to take, and they would be wrong funding priorities. I think research interests also sometimes, get pushed in wrong directions because of looking at this in the wrong way. Government policy, I do feel, has been influenced by looking at data correctly. So, for example, and I think, one of my favorite examples of this is the speed at which government can try to self-correct. So, one of the things that I think about and talk about a lot is around fertility in India, right? Birth rates and fertility. And one of my favorite stories here is that a few months ago, Chandrababu Naidu took a look at Andhra Pradesh's data and decided that a 30-year-old law that barred people with more than 2 children from contesting local body elections was a bad idea, given that, birth rates in Andhra Pradesh had fallen. So the law was repealed. And then within a couple of days, Chandrababu Naidu proposed that eligibility to contest elections be restricted to people with only more than 2 children. And to me, that is in some case emblematic of how we have responded to data, which is to not look at it for very long, and then when it smacks you in the face, to look for the closest danda lying around to once again come up with some sort of coercive state solution to that. You could argue that many state governments, including southern, particularly the southern states, are thinking harder now about things like aging than they have before, and it is because the data has smacked them in the face. While these are states that have been below replacement fertility for 20 years now, so they have no justification for being so shocked by it now. I think the conversation about female labor force participation also was prompted by data and by this big dip that happened in the early 2000s. Again, I think solutions, it's taken very long to catch up there. But then again, we had a budget, one or two budgets ago, where the finance minister talked about childcare in the creches and childcare. So those are, to my mind, examples of policy reorienting to what the data shows. And see, I mean, if you think of data as a collection of human experiences and of governments and particularly political parties being jobs being to respond to the human experience, then one doesn't get so cynical about, oh, do they even care about data? Well, yes, their model is centered on the human experience, which is distilled through data. So I don't think, any of us should be surprised by political parties and governments allowing data to help them take decisions.
In your essay on fertility, you pointed out that just 3 months before Chandrababu Naidu did his thing, the state had actually debarred people with more than 2 kids from contesting local elections. So the opposite direction. But this is absolutely not your fault. I agree, data is massively useful and what you're doing is a great public service. But unfortunately, the clearer that data becomes, the more it encourages a delusion that the state has. It can create engineering solutions to social problems. I agree that and we'll talk about this in much more detail, obviously, but I agree that the impact of declining fertility is massive and all kinds of things could go wrong. But at the same time, this is not something the state should do anything about coercively, any more than it should have done the coercive action by it to control the growth of population.
No, I absolutely agree. I find data around fertility very interesting, and I think India should be part of the low birth rate conversation. And then what it does with it is, up to it. But I personally, I can't find myself very worked up about low birth rates. I mean, all of the good research around this shows that this is broadly a trend of people choosing a better life for themselves. It's a bit hard to get mad at people choosing a better life for themselves, whether it means women choosing to study and work, which is one part of the story, but not the only part of the story. Because in India, for example, we are seeing low birth rates while most women have their children still in their 20s. India is not the UK or other parts of the world where this is the, delaying childbirth for career. That is not the story over here at all. We have such low female labor force participation, so that's clearly not the story. But there is some intangible sense, tangible, intangible sense of a better life that underlies low fertility by choice, which is what we see here. I find it hard to get mad at that. And I find it hard to get mad on behalf of humanity, right? Which is a lot of the argument that you need people for civilizations to persist, you need people for innovation, you need people for the world as we knew it to continue. I find it hard to feel anything, to take any umbrage on behalf of civilization.
I mean, nothing good can come out of thinking in terms of the good of abstract terms like society or civilization or the nation. To me, everything is about, the consent and agency of individuals. So I completely agree with you there that, what individuals choose to do and whether they choose to have kids or not is entirely their. You also, just pointed out that why should the state not care about numbers? Numbers, after all, are people in action. The state cares about people. But I would imagine the state doesn't care about people per se. The state cares about what people care about because, they need to get votes in the next election, and that's really what matters. So a more critical part of your mission, in a sense, is to get these stories out there more widely, to get people to just use data whenever they feel like instead of going to Wikipedia or asking ChatGPT, like you said, hey, let's go to Numbers for India and check out what they have to say, etc., etc.
Data for India.
Yeah, Data for India, sorry. So how do you think about that aspect of, how does one balance between these, of getting the data, telling the stories with the data, and then proselytizing not just the data, but the use of data?
So I do disagree with that argument as such, which is I don't agree that states care about what people care alone. I do, and I think actually numbers have been central to state welfareism and in a broad sense of what this new country was going to do, what its aim and mission was, which was the eradication of poverty and development, and the role that numbers were to play, that statistics were to play in a planned state to achieve those aims. And I feel like a lot of the role and response of using numbers by the Indian state has been towards specific development strategies, preferences, outcomes, some of which have been incredibly successful. And this is something that, I do find profoundly moving when you do see numbers that improved over generations, where you see things that were deeply different realities for your parents or grandparents compared to what they are now, and that that this has come as an outcome of planned strategies, whether some of those were specific strategies or more of those, in my view, have come as a result of the broad arc of a country getting richer. That the extent of that can be debated, but yeah. So on that broad
but to
thing,
stay there, can you think of a specific example of when a state has looked at data and done something that you would say is the right course of action, even though it wasn't going to help them electorally?
No, so I wouldn't be able to, but I would say, and the reason that I wouldn't be able to is because I do think that good is rewarded by voters, but I don't see that as the sole driving force. I do think that there is a broad developmental ethos, and that's actually continued from government to government. It hasn't been a particular party or a particular government, and I would say particularly since the early 2000s, that particularly strong and that expansion of the welfare state, and we see its impact on all this huge acceleration in development outcomes as well as in growth that you see from the early 2000s. Does seem like a choice and strategies that paid off in ways that made for generational change. So So, I mean, I think what does happen at the end of it is that it does get rewarded by voters. Though, to be honest, that's an area that I feel most iffy about. What voters are rewarding whom for
I mean,
seems poorly studied to
there's no
me.
correlation there, because after demonetization, they had a thumping victory in UP. And like the way that I think about it is our golden years in terms of the economy were really 91 to 2011, those 20 years. And that wasn't so much driven by data, but just by the conclusion that the path that we had taken was wrong. And normatively, there was a sense that, okay, markets need to be a lot freer, the state needs to get out of the way. And as long as that trajectory continued, it was all awesome. But around the end of UPA 1, the start of UPA 2, we started kind of going to hell again. And the numbers back up that story. But did it drive any of those actions? I don't know. I mean,
But I think the expansions in social security programs that began from UPA 1 were an example of responding to numbers. So I would say the Right to Education Act, the expansions of food security, all have come as and in a way, you can argue that everything is a response to numbers, right? Because anything that has anything to do with trying to make people better off or better fed, you could argue that all of it is in response to numbers. So I do think that that's a bit specious on my part as well. But so, I mean,
No, I take back what I said. I mean, obviously, even the normative belief of the 91 reformers was on the basis of numbers of how much markets had done in the West and how much growth there had been in the rest of the world. And you just had to compare the communist countries with the free markets. So I buy that completely. But in terms of how responsive the state is to numbers, I'm not so sure. And I'm not even sure the welfareism that started at around the end of UPA 1. I mean, RTA is hardly a good example, because the numbers in education indicate that just pumping in more and more government spending into education isn't leading to better outcomes at all. So
so not on outcomes, but I think, and I'm not sure how much of RT's stated goals even right from the beginning even talked about outcomes. But I think there's been the expansions in enrollment and the complete closure of the gender gap in enrollment are things that we see now, which was certainly not the case 40 or 50 years ago. But yeah, what I mean is, I do think that there was an acknowledgement and a response to development indicators, and a pretty strong element of looking at data. I think food security was another aspect of that. I think even with the NREGA, the thinking around rural employment, around seasonality, around minimum wages. Yeah, but again, this is here you can argue everything is as a response to numbers, as I would.
fair enough. Tell me about building the organization. Like, once you decided you were going to do this, your next task is something that you haven't really done before. And you mentioned that not only were you looking to build the organization, you wanted to build a good and kind organization. So what do you mean by this? How did you come to the vision of something like this being necessary, a good and kind organization, as opposed to what I'm presuming you saw before in the workplaces you were? So tell me about that arc that led you to thinking that I want to build a particular kind of org, and then we'll talk about the challenges of actually building that kind of org.
Yeah, so I think here again, it's something that happened to me more than me having done things intentionally. First of all, we're still small. We're 10 people, and we were even smaller in the first year, and then able to add people slowly. I think anyone coming to work for us then was taking quite a leap of faith. We were not up and running for our whole first year. There was no public-facing organization. The work was odd. It was quite unlike anything else, so especially to people on the technical side. It's fairly hard to explain what we're doing, what's going to come out of it. For writers as well, there's going to be, you're not going to be out there reporting, you're not going to be interviewing people in government, you're going to be writing 101 things about what is GDP and what is GDP per capita. So anyone who came to work here was taking a leap of faith. Then we are a fully remote team, there's no office, so you're going to see me twice a year, and I'm this, I'm office presence who you see sometimes over a call. I've never run anything before. Please come and work here, despite the fact that I've never run anything before. All of those, I mean, it meant that we attracted a certain sort of person, which is someone who truly was passionate about doing this work in India. And then I think the rest of it was oh my God, this is an actual company and we're going to need to do things like have an HR policy, and that stuff came a little later. But then also the sense of wanting to do right by all of those things, and these people who've taken this leap of faith, not wanting them to feel like they're in this strange and uncertain place. So putting in even things, that traditional things like having a predictability, regular calls, teams, that sort of stuff. So that's all stuff that happened to me rather than me driving it. I think I'm also very fortunate that some of the people in our team have either been leaders in other organizations, have thoughts about running a place that's kind and good. And I think many of us also have the experience of having worked in pretty toxic places. So there was all of the things that we knew that we didn't want to do. I have worked in a company, for example, that, of course, a 60-week. I've only always worked in companies with 60 weeks. We aren't now. Data for India is not a 60-week. But so if you took a holiday on a Saturday, then, and if Sunday was your weekly off, then Sunday became leave without pay because you had, scammed the company to take a Saturday off. Yeah. So at least I knew what I didn't want to do. And I think there's also just the standard stuff of being a remote organization, right? It requires a different sort of thinking. It requires you to be an adult with with the people in your team. So yeah, these were all things that I never thought that I would think these things through, but I'm really happy to also have others in my team who I can discuss this and who also discuss this with, and who also want to build a place that's that's a happy place, that does good work, that's mission driven, but also functioning well, and keeps people feeling connected and happy despite us all being remote.
So there are sort of a lot of difficult balancing acts involved when you're a manager, when you're running an organization. For example, on the one hand, of course, you don't want to be the toxic boss who's always looking over the shoulder and etc., etc. But at the same time, there's a danger that, especially because it's remote, that you don't know what people are doing, and there might be people who are slacking off and etc., etc. And how did you work past all of those issues? Like, because in great depth, being a data person yourself and a journalist yourself, every aspect of what they're doing, there would have been the temptation to kind of micromanage and to sort of just jump in and do that. But at the same time, you simply don't have the time to do that. You have to delegate, you have to trust, which is such an important part. So, was that a difficult journey figuring that out, or was a key part of that just in hiring people? Because I imagine that you would probably be paying less to your people than they might get in other jobs, and therefore there is a selection effect at play, that someone who's working for you is already kind of sold to the mission, and you don't have to supervise them that much because they're already driven, they know who you are, they know what you're doing, etc., etc. So, how did your thinking on that evolve? What were your experiences like?
Yeah, no, so we try not to do that. The second part, which is we try not to have people come to work for us out of a sense of charitable do-gooding, and for this to be a satisfying in every way workplace for them, irrespective of them also caring about these things. We just try to be a decent, competitive, good employer in that respect as well. Everyone we've hired has already, so we don't have very young people here, just because the work is a bit more advanced. And I think all that it means, I think a young person would fit in just as well. But I think all that it means is these are people who have worked before, probably have already done some amount of remote work before. This is not a solitary mission at all. So my colleague Apurva Anand, who leads data operations, he and I run the organization jointly, and so it means there's two of us, mom and dad, as I joke, to look after the different teams.
Are you the mom or the dad?
I'm usually the mom. Yeah. So it's it's the two of us. It's the two of us who care about the same things, and equally care about building a kind organization. And then everyone's got so much to do. So I think I've, at no time at all has slacking off been a thought in our minds of concern about other people. And I imagine never has it been a thought on anyone else's mind in the team as well, because there is so much to do. So I think, you pick work that you like, you pick an organization that you like, you pick competent people, everyone's plate is full, and everyone's pulling towards the same thing, excited about what they're doing. It just feels as simple as that.
And what's a typical day like? Like, what's a typical work day for you like? What's a typical work day for them like? Like, if I was working remotely for someone, it would become a big problem for me, no matter how well-intentioned I am and no matter how great my work ethic is. There is a temptation to kind of become really flexible with your time and perhaps not work as hard as you would. Plus, I think in physical offices, I last worked in a physical office some 15, 16, 17 years ago. But in physical offices, there is also the happiness of the serendipitous encounters, the water cooler conversations, the stuff that can come out of that. Like, working alone can be incredibly solitary. You're not really bouncing your ideas off everyone all the time. It can get monotonous. And how much self-driven can you be? That would certainly, just looking at myself, be a problem for me, might not be a problem for others. So, what was your experience with that, A, as a remote worker, and B, as someone working with other remote workers?
So I think we're fairly conservative in how we run it as a workplace, which is we all start at roughly the same time, which is fairly, early, and we start at the same time. We start with a team call, which everybody is on. And then we speak to each other multiple times through the day. I'm also very big on wrapping up early. So I need to wrap up early because my kids come home from school and we do sports stuff in the evenings. I want everybody to have a life. And I think ideally maybe everybody shouldn't have to have the same timings as me. So it should have been that you get to have a life, and that life might be at whatever time of day you want. But because we need to do coordinated stuff, it just makes more sense for us for everybody to do the same hours. We strictly don't work weekends either, and we have a fairly liberal leave policy as well. But that said, I think everybody struggles with working alone. A couple of people in the team are in the same city, so they try to meet once in a while. As a team, we meet twice a year. We love that. We're all big coffee drinkers in the team, so our recent offsites have all been around coffee. We're all big outdoors people as well. Some are runners, some are trekkers. So that's worked very well for meeting twice a year. But yeah, so we try to think of ways to make this a less solitary and a happier experience for everybody. We've started a Thursday. Our Thursday team call is videos on for everyone except someone who can't, and we share a photo from our camera roll from that week, and just it's a strictly no work call. So whatever people did that week, what someone cooked or where they went, or a route they ran or something. So yeah, those are the small things we try to do. But yeah, I think it's hard, that aspect of not getting to bounce things off each other. It becomes a bit more task driven then, in a way that I think many of us would enjoy much more collaboration. But again, it makes just the advantages just outweigh that so much, which is that nobody had to upend their lives and move to Chennai to do this.
No, that Thursday call is such a beautiful practice.
I call it Thursday Thindi.
The Thursday Thindi.
Yeah.
I should try that with my friends, actually. It's just a beautiful way to stay in touch with each other's personal lives. What's the last photograph you shared?
So I try to spend a lot of time outdoors, and Chennai does allow that quite a bit. So the week before that there's a new wetlands park that's opened up, and I went there and I took a picture of a spot-billed pelican that was floating by. The week after that, I had just returned from Bangalore, so I took a picture while crossing a river from the train. So that was my most recent one.
Sounds like so much fun. Let's take a quick break, and on the other side of the break, we'll actually dive deep into the kind of work that you've been doing.
Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I loved the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercised my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you.
Welcome back to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm still chatting here with Rukmini. We drank some tea, had a fascinating conversation about many, many things, including friendship, optimistic nihilism, running on beaches, the single-digit AQI of Chennai, and which made me really mad because, hey, like, just look at Bombay. But let's get back to talking about the work that you've been doing. Tell me about your newsletter, The Big Shift. What's the name about and what prompted it?
So I think one of the exciting things that the data that we look at allows us to do is to look at change over a long horizon, typically from 1950 onwards, because that's when most Indian data sets begin. And I think this is one more of the things that I feel it feels so fake to say privileged about everything, but I actually feel privileged to be able to do this here because since I now work in a team that also has engineers, that has data scientists, and we've built these great tools for us writers to be able to look at the data, I am able to every day look at data from the 1950s onwards. And it gives me a picture of a changing country in a way, again, that I feel that little else that I read around me gives me. And I think, again, all of the incentives in newsrooms is to tell you about what happened today at most compared to last year, and in its worst examples compared to what happened in the last government, right? That's where history seems to end. And the prospect of not having to do that and to be able to talk about the long arc of change has been very exciting. I think it's also allows for a lot of nuance because there is always, in fact, it's hard not to write the same thing each time, which is to say, wow, look how much things have improved, but then things could be better. But no, it's really quite different depending on what I look at. So the newsletter is called The Big Shift, and the idea is that we tell these stories of change. It's like if you picture India in a series of line charts that begin in 1950, that's what we're trying to do over here. And I think each time, it does surprise me that each time there is something different in the direction of that line chart. Sometimes the point is that it hasn't improved as much as you'd want it to. Sometimes the point is that it's improved so much for some place rather than another. Sometimes it is that we've done well, but others have done better. And why is it that others at the same level of income, for example, have been able to do better? So that's what the data is centered around. The other aspect is that on Data for India, we're, as I said, fairly conservative across the board, which is we're conservative in data sources. We're also fairly conservative in our writing. We are not trying to do rhetorical flourishes over here. The idea is that this is a knowledge resource. But with The Big Shift, I do a little bit more of, and it's really not instrumentalizing here. It's that I enjoy telling a story of change. So here I don't feel like I'm manipulating people's feelings or trying to make them care about the numbers, in a very intentional way. But the tone is different. It's a feeling of discovery, for me, and I communicate that. I think, I don't hold back on that sense of feeling either moved, which I regularly do with Indian data, or that feeling of awe at what the numbers say. But yeah, that's what the newsletter does, and I've done it every week for a year now, and we're in edition 53 will go out on Wednesday morning.
Amazing. We are recording this on December 8th, 2025, though you're here listening to the episode on, hopefully, if the date releases is January 26, 2026. You mentioned that there are times you've been moved and there are times you felt awe. Can you give me examples of these?
So one of the charts that I find very moving is it's a and I'll share it with your listeners as well. It's what you call a dot plot, which is that you picture a bunch of lines, horizontal lines, and each line has 2 dots on it. One is the dot for male literacy and one is the dot for female literacy, and the lines are age groups. So right at the top of the chart is children, and then there's teenagers, people in their 20s, and all the way down to people who are today in their 70s. And what you see is that, so when you look at people in their 70s, these would be, say, grandparents for some of your listeners, or parents for some of your other listeners, or some of your listeners themselves. And you see this huge gap between male and female literacy rates for people in their 70s. And this is a story that resonates. You do know that the likelihood of either going to school or making it through school was so much higher for boys then. And you just see the distance between those 2 dots reduce to the point that it's disappeared for children today. So that one axis of disadvantage and discrimination, we've closed it, and we've closed it in this within families, right? We've seen it happen within generations that we are witness to, that the gender gap in enrollment, and as a result the gender gap in literacy has been closed. I find that really moving. I find that there is an intentionality that was behind it. It also is a story of parental drive that I see every day, that I really find very moving. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but when I drop my kids to school in the morning, and here are 2 very privileged children going in a car to school. We carpool with a friend, but that's about it, right? And in the narrow streets that we take to their school, there are often children, most of the other children going to school are on bikes with behind a parent or a grandparent, and often children walking as well. But one thing that's common to all of them, mine and these other children, is how neatly dressed they are for school. Indian children go to school with every hair oiled into place, absolutely perfect uniforms, talcum powder on the face sometimes. And the work that it's taken for parents and very often mothers to get those children looking that neat and going safely to school is the story that has resulted in numbers like this, right? It's maybe government made the case, but then there is huge personal sacrifice and just a commitment to a better life for children that I see every day that's driven these sorts of outcomes. So I find that moving because I feel like I can see the personal sacrifices that have led to a point that we've been able to make this change happen.
And this is moving, and I guess it's also, it can fill you with awe. But while the extent of it is delightful, the directionality is what you would pretty much expect, that things will get better as far as narrowing that gap is concerned. But
I think not necessarily. So you would expect things to improve, but where there are axes of discrimination, those changing means something extraordinary has happened, right? If you picture 2 parallel lines that go up but remain parallel, that's often the story of things that you see, for example, with rural urban, that things are improving for both, but they're in parallel to each other, and the gap between the 2 has not really changed. So when you see lines converge, it means that something slightly extraordinary has happened, and this isn't just the normal way of things.
So it
Something
doesn't just
abnormal
mean
had to happen.
it doesn't just mean that more girls are getting educated, but it also means that discrimination against girls has stopped, and it's just a whole social shift.
I would say even just the fact that more girls are getting educated was not the natural way of the world at one point. So the fact that it happened did mean that something extraordinary happened and things changed. Any gaps closing, lines converging, means that things stopped being the way that they were. They didn't just improve, but particular disadvantages dissolved.
Where I was getting at though is, like you of course corrected me and said that it is actually not as, you can't take it for granted, the directionality. But where I was getting at is that is there sort of some trend or some data which has actually taken you completely by surprise?
Actually, that happens a lot, and I enjoy that feeling very much. So let me give you, one example, and let me tell you a funny story about it as well. And I think data typically surprises people who I speak to in one of two ways. Either the country is so much poorer than they thought, or the country is so much richer than they thought. And both happen. And I think being able to confront that and accept it is fairly uncommon. I do find that. So one of the numbers that surprises me quite a lot is to do with the extent to which the ownership of things like bikes has increased in India, two-wheelers, but also things like washing machines. So I would like to pride myself on not being someone who has bought into that vision of the country of everything's so terrible, nothing's improved, or the worst end of it, which is everything has actively got worse, which is just not borne out by any socio-economic data that you look at, except for things like air quality, I'd say. But the extent of ownership of these, of this still surprises me. So the funny story in this here is, I was once talking to a group of people where I had two things to tell them. So one was about just how low car ownership is in India. And then simultaneously, I was making the point to them about how high bike ownership is, including among the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of urban households. And this group that I was speaking to was perfectly willing to accept the first number, but just could not get past the second number. And they kept pushing back, saying, maybe these are second hand. This is one of the big reasons that people get into loans and debt. The idea that, so there was that comfort with, yes, very few cars. This is the level of poverty that we expect in the country. But simultaneously, very high bike ownership. It was just not something that they were able to fit into their mental model of the country at all. And I'm always so amused by how people try to find fault with the data, with things like, sure, but then doesn't it reflect high levels of debt? Where did you get that from? That's just nowhere in the numbers at all. But then, these are the fictions you come up with to comfort yourself with the feeling that your notion of the country is what you thought it was.
Was there a time when you changed your mind in a big and fundamental way because the numbers were just so stark?
I think that happens quite regularly. So I think on Data for India, we have a vertical that we call living conditions, and we debate internally a lot about whether we should, if that's the right name for it, because, what is a living condition? But essentially what we capture there is access to services, amenities, basic stuff, as well as asset ownership. And broadly, most things on that tend to surprise me. So I think what's useful then is to put it together towards some sort of theory or some sort of notion of the country. And that notion that I have come to learn is that access to basic amenities, including things like electricity, water, etc., have improved far faster than I had pictured. So just how widespread and these comes from surveys where people are reporting their own living conditions. So we have a chart again that I love on the site that is to do with the primary source of energy used to light the house. So again, this is not number of bulbs provided by the government. This is what the household is reporting that they are using. And if you look at rural India in particular, these are two lines that intersect and go in absolutely the opposite direction. And you see this in the course of just 30 years, which is that electricity has replaced kerosene as the primary source of energy to light up Indian households. If you asked me what the levels of electrification in India were, and by which again we are not talking about provision of lines but actual usage, I would not have said that it is nearly 100%, but that is that's what comes as reported through surveys. And I find it very I think it should humble us all when we see these numbers that make us realize that we had not realized how far, because this is what development is, right? What is development if not things like electrification, access to water, etc. And I find it useful to update my notions of how far that has gone now in India, to a point that this is not something that we're going to repeatedly come back to, because now we know that this is something that we're at 100% for many of these things. And these changes have happened relatively recently. So it does take me by surprise.
How often have you found the need to actually theorize about the world because the old theories can't quite match up? Like in one of your essays, you speak about the different ways in which fertility is falling in India and in the world, right? You speak about the Dean Spears and Michael Geruzo book After the Spike, where they talk about the decline in fertility across the world, and what's happening there is that women are having fewer kids later, as you point out, and the reason for that is that they are empowered in different ways, they're going out in the workspace, etc., etc. But in India, as you point out, that explanation doesn't hold up, because it's not that women are having fewer kids later, they are instead having fewer kids earlier in their early 20s, and then they are just not having any more. And women's participation in the workforce is anyway low, so that explanation doesn't hold true. So here you find yourself therefore in a situation where the traditional conventional explanation simply doesn't work, and now you have to come up with, you don't have to come up with alternatives for it, you can just present the data, but I'm sure it's tempting for you to then think a little deeper about it. Earlier you alluded to more washing machines. Now again, that is something which from the little that I know of the West, the simple narrative that I know is that more washing machines free up women's time. It's an enormous source of women's liberation, and therefore you will have more empowered women, more women working, more independent women, which means more divorces as well, which is to me a fantastic metric for women's empowerment. But in India, it might not be, playing out in exactly the same way. So what do you think about this? Like, what are the theories that you then come up with about social change and about empowerment and so on? And to what extent do you give yourself the liberty to theorize, and to what extent do you just say that, no, I'm just going to put the data out there and I don't have to have the why for everything, I just have to do the what very well?
So I think my instinctive approach is typically to not theorize, but I think even in this is really one of the things that we've come up against a lot, which is, I don't think we started off intending to do this, but we have realized that there is a lot of groupthink within academia that we find has been quite damaging in the social sciences for a number of reasons. One is that research priorities and directions seem to have been set around often a misreading of data, and it also means that the universe of questions looked at sometimes shrinks quite a bit, and then there is a very polarized way of talking about some of these questions. And when we've looked more closely at the data, we have found that some of these things have not held up well enough. So even if you don't go in intending to theorize, you at least end up having to disprove theories or point out that the theory is not based on good data. So for example, when we were writing about anemia, we've written about how there are inexplicably high rates of anemia, and that these rates are very high even among demographic groups that you would typically expect to have better health outcomes. So this includes richer women and better educated women. We also then looked at whether the rates of anemia were higher among vegetarian women. And we have, of course, found published research that makes this claim. But when we looked at high quality analyses, we do find that controlling for other things, including income and everything else, there is no causal pathway, not a lack of a causal pathway, but there is no direction causational that can be established between vegetarianism and anemia in India. Yet I see this repeated regularly. Now, I think the bulk of the conversation about vegetarianism in India is based in bad data in another direction, which is there is typically the assumption of greater rates of vegetarianism than they are. But we also do see this argument advanced. One of the reasons for high rates of anemia is because of vegetarianism, which is just not borne out by the data at all. So we may not have come into writing about anemia with the intention to theorize about why this is happening, but we do end up finding ourselves having to engage with disproving theories. I think the anemia one is my best example of that.
Can you think of like another example of what you mentioned of, groupthink within academia, that, they'll come to a position because they've misread the data, and then, the debate will get polarized and they'll be firm on it. And, and a lot of academic ideological positions tend to almost shade into dogma where you simply can't even question that.
Yeah.
So are there any striking examples of that which stand out? And when, academia is actually presented with facts that counter their theory, how have they reacted? What's been happening there?
So I think actually the fertility conversation and some of the points that you outlined in this are a good example of this. So here again, you typically see the argument being made about low fertility in the southern and western states and high fertility in the northern and eastern states. And then what follows from it is the assumption that low fertility follows from growth development, access to health, education, etc. But I think we are seeing fair amounts of evidence both within India as well as in India's place in the world that this is a partial and not a complete explanation. I don't think that this is something that the Indian conversation has engaged with, and I would say that the groupthink here tends to be that fertility is tightly linked to education and incomes, and that is what the Indian story is. I think there's also some amount of rigidness around positions when it comes to female labor force participation as well. So for example, there has been a substantial increase in female labor force participation in the last 5 years. And if you Google around for explanations of this, it's almost embarrassing to see how they fall along two sides, with one side trying to essentially argue that there was no increase. And to do that, you have to claim that the data is bad, you have to claim that the quality of jobs produced was bad, you have to do all of these exercises, and on the other side you'll see explanations around how it points to some massive revival in jobs or the economy, and we do find with work like the work that we did around custom tailoring is that both parts are true and both parts are wrong, which is there has been an increase in female labor force participation. A lot of that increase is in this subsidiary work. There isn't a lot of increase in more highly paid salaried employment. So it's really, it's a mix of the two, and it just feels like that we're never going to get very good high quality research around this if everybody's made up their minds before the fact about what the data actually says and what the reasons for it are. So, and I'm sure it's not a coincidence that these are all things that coalesce around women and their bodies, that these, both when it comes to female labor force participation and fertility, positions and lines in the sand have been have been drawn in ways that don't invite conversation. And then you're just not surprised to see the same names publish the same things that argue the same things, irrespective of whether the data changes or not.
People jogging on the spot. I mean, that's a beautiful sort of phrase that Parumita Vora once used. And I go to many conferences and I find people who have been jogging on the spot for 30 years.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And you just know that it's unshakable, right? Like everything else will turn and change around them, but these positions will not, and they can be really quite hostile to any attempts at someone trying to move them off the spot.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things I used to jog on the spot about. I think, luckily, in the seen and the unseen, I keep getting challenged, and that kind of helps. Let's now talk about this. Since it is Republic Day, let us talk about India and have grand conversations like men with beards tend to do. That's another great phrase Paramita kind of unleashed on me, men with beards. You've written this beautiful 3-part essay called India's Demographic Dilemmas, right? So, take me through some of that, because some of that is stuff that I had a vague idea of. Some of it did kind of surprise me in the details. So, give me a sense of what are the 6 demographic milestones that India's kind of gone through. And
yeah, so I think in some respects, again, it would seem like that we've been having the demographic and population conversation for so long that it would seem that some of this shouldn't be surprising to us anymore. But then when you take stock of it, you do realize that it is a pretty significant moment and a period that we'll be going through. I think one of the things that happened is that with India surpassing China in terms of total population, the fact that population growth has been slowing down was maybe something that was, missed in the global conversation for a while. And just the fact that we, surpassed China doesn't change the fact that the trajectory for the future is one of, slow population growth from now on. That is what the long arc looks like for India. Related to this is also the difference between India's southern and northern states, which of course is significant in terms of population growth. But I do think that this difference is overstated to some extent, because these are processes that are going on only with some gap across the country. I also don't think that the gaps are as large as people sometimes make them out to be. And broadly, we are all the states are converging towards the same spot in terms of slowing down of population, in terms of aging, reduced fertility, all of that. So sure, there are differences and they're all at different points along the spectrum, but this is the broad Indian story as well. And I think one of the things, as we talked about earlier, that's been happening this year is the sort of overdue acknowledgement that we are now solidly below replacement in terms of fertility, an invitation in that respect to join the global conversation around slowing fertility, what it means for things like aging. I think one aspect of the fertility conversation is that this conversation has happened too late in the southern states, which shouldn't be looking at national numbers, which should have been looking at their own numbers for the last 20 years, but also the fact that this isn't again purely a northern and southern states thing. West Bengal is one of the country's poorest states, and West Bengal has been below replacement fertility for over 20 years now. So there, in fact, you have a state that is particularly poorly placed to deal with the population effects of aging, including things like pensions, welfare, etc. So definitely a delayed conversation, even if the national numbers are the ones that have changed now. I think an obvious and direct consequence of falling fertility means that you're just going to have fewer children born every year, and then you're going to have a smaller child cohort. And that does mean different sociologically. It does mean that the world around you is going to look very different. It means that you're less likely to see a child than you are to see, a young adult now. And it means that we need to think differently about things, even including school enrollment. We are now entering an era where fewer and fewer children are going to enroll in school because there just are fewer children? Is it going to mean, what does it mean in terms of fund reallocation? What does it mean in terms of all sorts of other allied professions, say pediatricians, for example, right? The future looks quite different when the child population starts to decline. So that's something we have to reckon with as well. I think we've heard the demographic dividend for so long now that it's lost all meaning. But if you actually think of it in terms of its definition, in terms of the number of years that a country has where its child population is declining and its elderly population has not yet grown that much that its working age population really stands out, it's quite clear now that we're at the end of that window that we had. And irrespective of what it means for the country, it perhaps at least means that phrase now needs to be retired, because that chapter in every report, India's demographic dividend, is now one that's really relatively meaningless. So we've definitely reached that point now. It also means very different things about what makes people sick and what people die from. So as a country gets older, it does mean that non-communicable diseases, things like heart disease and cancer, become far more important. We've seen this transition across the country, and now we're seeing it in the poorer states as well, where communicable diseases just play a much smaller role than they did in the past. Again, what it means in terms of public health priorities is really something to contend with. What do you think about a future in which, say, malaria is a far less serious threat to relative mortality than other, than non-communicable diseases? It's quite a reorientation, and I'm really not sure if we're there yet. And the last one is that we've reached a point where we are used to two things happening at the same time. One being relatively young, and secondly, growing and developing such that the risk of things like dying in childhood as well as in infancy started going down, and so overall mortality was declining. But now as we start growing older, we're going to see that rise again, and not for the reasons that it has historically, but for just the reasons of a very different country. And that's quite a tipping point. It's quite a serious moment to think about, when after generations of mortality declining, you're going to see both relative and absolute mortality increase every year, as it has already started. So it is in many ways a very unusual place to be in. It is in some ways a transition from a lower income country into a middle income country, and what some of those changes look like. And it's also, we do live in, we do straddle two realities where we do simultaneously have, so for example, with infant mortality, Kerala is at infant mortality levels comparable to Northern European countries, while Madhya Pradesh is at infant mortality rates comparable to Sudan. So we do have those two speeds going on. So we're straddling sort of two elements of two speeds of the demographic journey.
The heading for the 6 of your sort of findings in your first essay was mortality rising, and that really surprised me. And this was a TIL for me, because of course we know the trajectory that child mortality has been going down, life expectancy is rising, blah blah blah. But to actually have data like this thrown at you that mortality is growing up just indicates the flip side of the demographic dividend, that we're now going to at some point become an aging country, and that's going to become an issue. And even the other point you made about that epidemiological transition, congratulations to me to actually manage to pronounce it, though I don't know if I was right, but I managed to say it, was also enlightening, because it gave a framework to something that Chandrabhan Prasad ji expressed on my podcast ages ago. Chandrabhan Prasad is a great Dalit scholar. He did an episode with me, and one of the things he said there, which surprised me among many counterintuitive things, was that whenever an elder in his family gets diabetes, the whole family celebrates. right? And this is exactly the transition that you have pointed out, that as we get wealthier, we die less from communicable diseases like malaria and so on, and more from non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular issues or cancers, and indeed diabetes. And the Indian diet is a diabetes machine. Frankly, it's a travesty. So that essay gave me lots to think about, and I'll link it from the show notes. Tell me about, if you take these trends together, you see us at a particular moment in time. And in many ways, it's a critical moment in time. It's important for us to sort of take stock of this. So tell me why. Tell me why it's like so important, and the next few years, in fact, are so important. And what could policymakers do if they take this into account? I mean, apart from aiming for higher and higher growth, which of course we should, when we think of the implications of this and the impact of this, what are the calls to action that emanate from that?
So I think the easier ones to think about are economic. So when we talk about the working age population and the its relationship with the dependent population, the idea there is to think about whether both individuals and the state can handle a growing burden of dependence, whether children or the elderly, and in our case now increasingly the elderly, while simultaneously having a shrinking working age population. So there's that economic aspect. It's also the question of, did we get the education and skilling that we wanted to get to this cohort that was going to become the working age population before the demographic window closed, which was what the point of the demographic dividend was supposed to be, is that you're going to have this large number of people who can take off. Now, if you really educate and skill them well, then that will have its big impact. And I think we have fallen short in that respect, and there is that to worry about. There is also the stuff that's sociological. So what it's going to mean for aging, and particularly I think when you start thinking about younger people migrating to cities, and when there is just one child or two, and what it means for aging parents, what it means for small families, what it means for families where there are no siblings. These are all sociological things that we have to contend with as well. I mean, I don't think we are not a country that's terribly used to the concept of an only child, and now we see it quite a lot around us, and I'm always very curious about what that's going to feel like in the future. And then there's just the change in our own conception of ourselves, right? If you think of a train journey, a long train journey, you're used to picturing a compartment with a lot of children running around. And when people travel to South Korea, for example, something people often come back and say is how struck they were by how few children they saw around them on public transport, for example. What does it mean when our country starts looking different, when you don't any longer see that many children in a train compartment, and you're more likely to see elderly people there? So I think there's all of this stuff that just means that our own conception of our country is going to change, and we're going to need to think differently about it. I also think that state governments are have been particularly slow moving on this. So the fact that Kerala and Tamil Nadu, with such high median ages and high working age populations, have been so slow to think about aging beyond things like private assisted living solutions, but very little state thinking around it, while simultaneously having this fairly hostile attitude to interstate migration, which again, when you look at the numbers, if anything, is too low. We have extremely low interstate migration, for one of the reasons being that it is expensive and it's not something that's easily done. So if you're simultaneously going to be a very old state, while at the same time being extremely hostile to interstate migration, who do you think is going to do your jobs? It just, the math isn't mathing.
Let's talk about fertility as well, declining fertility. What is sort of like, first of all, how do you arrive at these figures? You've outlined the kind of data that you've used. How reliable is it? How do you arrive at the figures that you do? The last census was so long ago, etc., etc. Take me through that process.
Yeah, so luckily, demographic data is not dependent on the census and comes through a couple of other mechanisms that have had some pandemic delays, but otherwise have, continued fairly systematically. So it's good quality data, and also it conforms to every projection. At no point has fertility in India really deviated from long-term projections. So the very fact that people are so surprised by this just means that they've not been paying enough attention to the numbers, because every projection has always shown that this was the expected pathway. So the data is pretty good. That's not really where the challenge lies. And yeah, essentially what the data shows is this, that similar to the rest of the world, we are now well below replacement fertility and well on track to see our population decline in absolute terms from the early 2060s onwards. We'll have to see if that happens earlier than 2060, but yeah, that's essentially where fertility stands right now in India. And the sooner both India joins the global conversation and the global conversation opens up to India, the better, because India does complicate the global conversation in some way. So as you mentioned earlier, we are at below replacement fertility, first of all at under $3,000 per capita income, so really quite poor to already be at replacement fertility, though in no way does this make us an outlier. We're sort of in the middle of the distribution there. We're also at below replacement fertility with very low female labor force participation, so that again, shoots in the foot many of these grand theories around fertility. I do think that a lot of the low birth rate conversation, particularly in the West, has had a weird eugenics-ish tone to it, which has made, entering it a bit daunting and maybe even inhospitable to many others. But we need to get over that, because everybody owns this conversation. So it's essentially the Elon Musk-ish panic about low birth rates, which is not just about low birth rates, but it is low birth rates of our kind of people. So to simultaneously have a panic about low birth rates and to be virulently anti-immigrant, again, the math doesn't math over there. Then your concern about low birth rates when it is only in, say, Western Europe, and not in the rest of the world. So it isn't that we want everyone to have more children wherever they are, but we want people who look a certain way and live in some countries to have more children, and to treat it almost like a societal obligation. All of that gets into slightly weird and racist territory. So the sooner India enters this conversation, the better, because we complicate the global conversation. It just means that most grand theories about why this is happening or what can be done to change it just don't work once you bring India into the mix. Because if the argument, as many, again, Elon Muskish people make it, is that Western liberalism, feminism have made women feel that careers are more important than families, and that is why birth rates are falling, and we need to show women again that the traditional life is the great life, and that will make birth rates rise. Well, women in India have their children from 21 years onwards, and they're at very low labor force participation rates. They are not. What is happening simultaneously is the lack of a career and low birth rate. So, I think I would enjoy seeing how all of this data explodes in their little brains.
I love the phrase, "the math doesn't math." It's such a great phrase. What are your sort of candidate theories for the why of it? Like, it's obvious that those theories break down that, yeah, it's not Western liberalism and feminism and workforce participation and all that. But then why?
So this isn't my own theory. I borrowed this from Dean Spears and Michael Geruso from their book After the Spike. And what I like is that there is a humility in the book in acknowledging that grand theories don't work and don't add up. And what they finally land on is that perhaps there isn't a grand theory, and perhaps where we are is that for multiple tangible and intangible ways, people, including women, have decided that there are many things that make life better by having fewer children. And those are not necessarily career. In some cases, they are career prospects. In some cases, they are not. And the prospect of a better life is very enjoyable. And one of the pathways to it is to free up your time by having fewer children. And this is something that slowly humanity at all of its different spaces has come to. That makes sense to me. It makes sense to me both in terms of what we see from the data, as well as when friends express why they don't want to have children. It often, lands up in some place like this, which is it is a desire for more of the things that make life nice, whatever those things might be.
From grand theories to grand projections, I was, struck by this mention that you made in your essay of someone who made a 75-year projection of fertility and all of that. And whenever I hear terms like 75-year projections, it just sounds batshit insane to me, because the world is so complex, there's so much going on. How can you have the hubris to make a 75-year? I mean, it's hard enough to predict the past. So predicting the future just seems crazy, especially 75 years out. So what is your sense of these kind of projections, because they actually tend to claim to do it on the grounds of data, except they extrapolate it to mad levels and have no grounds for doing so? And have there ever been 75-year projections in the past which have held true?
So I think there are some things that projections are going to get very wrong, and we know that right now. So for example, I think nobody knows what's going on with urbanization in India. It could be going much faster than we think. It could be going much slower than we think. I am inclined to think that it's going slower than we think, but we don't know. So when the census comes out, we will have a new view of urbanization that I imagine will surprise everyone. We don't know what's happening with migration either. I do suspect that, again, I think it could be going much slowly than we think. So these are things that projections are going to get wrong. The models around demographic projections are pretty good. They're based on pathways that most of the world has followed. Unfortunately or fortunately, these are pretty well-defined pathways. We've seen them in other countries, and they're essentially replicating across the world. The internal components of those projections include things like mortality, fertility, birth rates, migration, all of which are fairly well understood. So unless something truly dramatic and widespread across the world were to happen, I would say the numbers are not going to be perfect. They're not going to be perfect at the single digit level, but they are broadly going to get things right. However, my colleagues Pramit and Nandlal have written a piece about population projections, and what they do find is that short-term projections are decent. The longer out you go from a census, the worse the projections get. So sometimes when people say, why do we even need a census? It's needed for things like this, to be able to course correct on things like projections and, pull your projections back in line periodically.
Yeah, I was, another of the things I was surprised by in the third of your essays was about interstate migration, where on the one hand you point out that internal migration within India is like so high that 3 in 10 Indians report that they now live somewhere different from their last residence for at least 6 months at a stretch. But then in the next breath, you point out that it's actually not very far, and most of them are not even leaving the state. So the interstate migration is really much lower. And given that there is so much difference between the states in terms of, for example, how many children are visible and the fertility rate, where in the case of, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, they were like decades ago, they were below replacement rate. Even West Bengal, the states are so different from each other. So what is sort of the impact of this going to be, and what are its implications for us?
I actually sometimes wonder how come we don't worry more about or at least theorize or talk more about how low interstate migration is. I don't know if it is because we're looking a lot at the overall number, or is it because we're not looking at numbers at all? And it is true that numbers, our statistics don't capture things fully because the definition is fairly static, while there is a lot more short-term and circular migration that the numbers miss. But yeah, to my mind, interstate migration is actually a rare phenomenon. It is something that requires a fair amount of, I think, social and actual capital to do, and not easy to undertake. The story of Indian migration really is intra-district, rural to rural migration. That is what most migration in India actually looks like. It's also largely a female story. The vast majority of Indian migration is actually done by women because of social norms around marriage. So I do think that there has been a very parochial hostility to interstate migration in the southern states. I think our cities are extremely expensive, and then you add on top of it issues around job availability, language, general political hostility. It does make the act of migrating to another state extremely difficult. It's an arduous thing to undertake. But I think for purely sort of mathematical reasons, the southern states in particular are going to have to take a long, hard look at their working age populations and try and just add up to figure out where the workers of the future are going to come from.
So since it's Republic Day, I'm going to ask you for a cinematic exercise. And this is an exercise in sort of building a time lapse with me. That if we come from 1950 to 2026 and I am to view the country in different ways through different lenses in a time lapse camera where things are changing, like in some instances you've already pointed out that, for example, we see male literacy and female literacy when those two lines converging, which is like you said, miraculous. But what are the other kinds of things we would see? Are there a few headline sort of changes you'd like to point out?
So I think what we would see is across the board on access to all sorts of services, you'd see a country in which things are slowly improving, and then you would see a speeding up of that improvement from the early 2000s onwards to the point that there would be almost like universal access to many of those by now. On things like electricity, drinking water, school enrollment, things like that. Then you'd see a pretty mixed picture on the economy. You'd see, fairly slow growth for the early decades. Then you'd see this acceleration in GDP growth. But what you'd also see is that there's actually been divergence among Indian states. What you'd want to see is convergence in terms of in economic terms, but both in terms of their share in national GDP as well as their relative per capita incomes. You see a growing divergence between the richer and poorer states, and that's something to really worry about for the future. You'd also see a country in which in the early years families were really large, 5 and 6 children. You'd see population growing at 2% annually, growing very fast. And then you'd see it start to taper off from the 80s and then, look very different. And I think you'd also see a really quick and also sort of moving reordering of what life looked like. So first of all, life expectancy was in the 40s at independence, and you see life expectancy to over 70 now. And you'd see that the burden of mortality, which used to rest on very young shoulders for decades, has reverted to its natural order, which is that now finally older people are more likely to die than the very young. Not universally, but you'd see that happen. I think you'd also see a closing of some gaps where you'd see essentially a rising tide lifting all boats and lifting all groups. But you would see that gaps don't end. So you don't see a closing of gender gaps in things like work. You don't see a closing of gaps in terms of both education as well as general incomes between caste groups, and you don't see that closing between Hindus and Muslims. You see some worsening inequalities over there. Yeah, and I think you would see the last 20 years in particular moving so much more rapidly than the ones before, that would maybe propel you into the next few years with a sense of optimism that things have moved so fast and maybe they'll move even faster, but with the hope that some of these gaps which endured for 75, 76 years now could be the ones that start to close faster.
So let's get back to talking about, data for India itself. And I wonder that when you get data, do you just take the data as it is and then use it to construct stories out of it and to go in for deeper insights? Or do you also examine the data and actually, do the forensic work of figuring out in the first place that whether the data is reliable and where it's going wrong? Like earlier in the conversation, you spoke about the importance of methodology, why it's important to look into that. So, what are your experiences with this?
So one of the things I'm really proud about with what we do is that we have built this ability to work very granularly with the data. So we have a research team headed by Pramit Bhattacharya, who was earlier Mint's data editor and now is our head of research. And his team's mandate is to look more closely at the data itself, which is that we want to engage with it, we want to understand how best to use it, and we want to try and understand if it works, if there are issues, if things add up. So, in fact, Pramit and my colleague Nandlal, who's also in the research team, were working once with India's periodic labor force survey, which is our main source of labor statistics. And they started looking at it more closely because there were some questions around, the share of men and women in the workforce, and something was not adding up. Instead of going ahead with what the data said, and there is, plausible deniability, right? Like it's a government survey, it's been produced, it's been published. Why should I have to look any more closely at it? So they started looking at the state level to try and figure out what was happening, and they realized the source of all fluctuations was Assam alone. So then they looked more closely at Assam, and they ended up finding that one small village in Assam was mistakenly assigned a weight several hundred times what the weight actually should have been to that village. In a representative sample survey, every sampled village is assigned a weight, and this village had some unusual characteristics. In an earlier census, it had been described as uninhabited. So it should actually not have made it to this survey. It shouldn't have been picked at all. But because of an error, it was picked. So what ended up happening is all of the unusual characteristics of this village got amplified to the whole state and then to the whole country as a result. So as a result of this error, Assam's population in the PLFS went from 30 million in 1 year to 90 million the next year to back to 30 million, all as a result of this one problematic village.
Which was given 61 million people for that year.
No, not the village alone. The village was given several times, but all of its
South Salmara, Mankachar.
That's right, yeah. A village that was earlier described as uninhabited, but then, and this village is unusual in some ways. It has a high outmigrant male population. So it has a large number of children. And the large number of children and women were then extrapolated to the whole state, and that threw all of the numbers off. So literally by going village by village to try and figure out what was happening, Pramit and Nandlal figured this out and ended up finding out that if you dropped this one problematic village, which was fine to do statistically, all of these fluctuations that we'd seen in overall labor numbers essentially disappeared. So they redid the numbers without that village and found that many national trends didn't look that way anymore, and pointed it out in a piece that they wrote. Now, we've been very gratified by the response from the statistical establishment themselves, which was to accept that there was an error and then also recommend that that village be dropped by anyone else doing that work in the future. So I'm not sure we came into this intending to go village by village, but I do think the advantage of having experts like Pramit and Nandlal in our team is that they are able to spot when something unusual is an artifact of the data, or there's something actually happening. And even if they're not able to spot it at first glance, they do the hard work of figuring out why we're seeing this in the numbers. So often their advice is to us internally about how to do a better job of doing our own analysis, and sometimes it's in this form which just provides instructional stuff for everybody using this data.
Have you tried unleashing AI on this data? Because I imagine, if not today, at least definitely in the near future, AI would be able to come up with all kinds of patterns and counterintuitive things which humans would miss.
Yeah, so there is work going on this. The data currently is fairly unstructured. I mean, it's not unstructured, but it is there's some distance from being able to identify things like this. We're not at all averse to, like everyone else, excited about the possibilities of what can be done. We're particularly excited about the possibilities of what can be done when it comes to data from courts and legal data, where one of the big shortcomings has been that we've had to work with pretty poor quality quantitative data because text was so hard to work with. And I think we're going to see a real change in what we're able to say about the Indian judiciary and access to justice because of what we're able to do using AI for data stuff. So yeah, we're excited about the possibilities.
So if I ask you, kind of, given the time-lapse picture you painted across all of these domains, if I ask you to look, say, as many years ahead as you want, because I know we overestimate the short term, underestimate the long term, etc., etc. Maybe look 25 years ahead. What's the best case scenario for India? Where would you like the data to go? Where would you like the graphs to go? And what's the worst case scenario? Given the fertility crisis and the fact that we missed the demographic dividend, as it were.
So I think actually 25 years from now would be an interesting spot, because to me the greatest reorientation that we're going to have to do is to a country where the population starts declining. For so long that has seemed like unimaginable. We've not even come to a point yet where we've retired the population explosion phrase, right, which should have been retired 75, 76 years ago. So to contend with a country in which the population is declining is where we will be 25 years from now, and that's going to be interesting. Yeah, I do think that the notion of a country, I mean, everything that we talk about is always geared in terms of already so-and-so is like this, and then with more people, what will happen? When you change all of that, how are we going to think about housing? How are we going to think about transport? How are we going to think about migration for a country that has fewer and fewer people every day? If I'm around, then I'll be just excited to see the mental somersaults that everyone will have to do then. Everything else, I find it hard to be prescriptive. You broadly want people to be more comfortable doing the things that they want to do. I think I feel more able to have hopes from what the data does and what people are able to do with the data rather than what the country is like then. So if we are at a place then that most people have a fairly accurate picture of the country, that everybody doesn't call themselves middle class, that is where I'd want our data systems to be. I'd love for us to be at a place where the likelihood of data being released does not depend upon whether it shows governments in good or bad light. If we've reached a level of political maturity where data systems are genuinely independent, and there's almost praise and reward for being able to work with independence and even call out flaws, that is the level of political maturity from the data that I want us to get to. Everything else technologically, expertise wise, where if not already there, we'll get there. But all I want is for greater independence of the data, but that will come as a result of political maturity.
And what do you mean if I'm around? You will, of course, be around. If I am also around, we'll do an episode and we'll kind of discuss what went wrong and what went right and all that. And Penultimate question with regards to your own life, and we discussed earlier about how you've kind of flown in from from data journalism to this and the sense of purpose and all of that, and I've also had glimpses of the other sides of you, the fiction reading Rukmini, the beach running Rukmini, the convivial photograph sharing, memory sharing, friendship deepening Rukmini, all of those sides. So tell me a bit about how you envisage living your own life. Is it more of the same? Like, people often think about the future version of themselves or the best version of themselves. Are you already kind of there and you're happy to go with the flow and refine that version? Or, is there something still ahead in how you see yourself where you think you're not there yet?
The only vision I have of myself is it feels so childish to even say it, but to be better. I think I have models of that. I have a good sense of what being, again, I'm going to say it's so childish, but of what being a good person looks like. And I think more and more it feels like the only point. And if I get to that point, that I feel that, I can feel that I'm there or somewhere there. I have so much clarity around that feels like the only thing that I want to get to.
Actually, that's the one thing, being a good person that I feel I've lost some clarity on, because intellectually I can construct what is, a good person, but is it achievable? Is it desirable? I don't know. So why don't you break it down for me? What is a good person to you? And why are you not already a good person?
It's a bit hard to talk about, but I'll give it a shot anyway, because it has in some respects to do with the last time I was on your podcast. I'm going to see if my voice holds, but let me try at least. I did think about it before coming on and decided I would not talk about it, but let's see if my voice holds. So the last time we met was in Bombay, and we were in what part of town was
Andheri.
it? Andheri, and this was in 2021, where my kids were even younger. They're small now. They were very small then. And the reason that I was there and there for so long was because they were with my best friend, who lived in Borivali, and they were both with her. And, as always, she said, go do what you want to do. And however long, I was looking out of your window, and it was getting darker. And in most other circumstances, that should be like a cause for worry. How are you going to, your kids are so small, they're away, how are you going to get home? But it was never a concern for me because they were with my best friend. And when I reached her house that day, my daughter was already asleep on her lap. She was so small and she'd gone to sleep. So she is the definition of a good person for me. And just 3 months later, she was gone. So that feeling has never left me of that the person who was a good person was the person who's gone. And I know that's not how the world is. It's not that anyone's goodness is, measured by someone else. I also know that this isn't a fair world, and so it isn't that the good people stay on. But at least the reason I have clarity about what a good person looks like is because she was my best friend.
I'm so sorry to hear this.
Yeah, but then what it also does is it gives you the clarity to know what you want to be. So in a few weeks, I'll be in Bombay again for Christmas with her family. And there'll be many of us there, her friends. And it'll be unequivocally everyone's view of her that this is what a good person looked like. So, when I was saying earlier to you that I feel like so many other people have, and their belief in me has let me do all these things in literal ways, in literal ways. When I was writing my book, that time the kids were small, pandemic, I was at home. She spoke to me on the phone one day. She could hear how stressed out I was. And she flew across the country in the middle of a pandemic to stay with me for nearly a month and babysat the kids, and I wrote the book. And again, it's not something that would come as a surprise to anybody who knew her. So, when you know what it looks like, and someone could do that, be that, then trying to do that or be that for other people feels like the clarity around that being the thing to do is crystal clear.
And we spoke at the start of this episode about how certain things that we do that become lines in the resume could be circumstantial, right? And equally, is it also the case, and I'm thinking aloud, that certain aspects of character can be circumstantial because we happen to be recipients of goodness from elsewhere? Like what you said about Pratap is also very moving to me, that Pratap encouraging you like that. When I won the Basya Prize in 2007 and I was a young journalist, and compared to Pratap, I was literally a nobody. Compared to who you would have been when Pratap wrote to you, I was a nobody. But Pratap just wrote to me out of the blue. I didn't know him from Adam, and said how much he loved my pieces and how much I deserved the prize, and that meant the world to me, just in terms of thinking better of myself. And he does it time and time again to people, and I keep telling myself that I have to treat young people the same way, that you've always got to be kind and encourage them, and it's just a kind of unconditional goodness that makes a difference to other people, and you're getting nothing in return for that. And similarly with your friend, when you realize what goodness looks like, and you want to kind of do that, do you think in different ways character is also circumstantial, that perhaps because we are privileged to have been treated in good ways by good people, that is something that can change us too?
No, absolutely. I do think that. I mean, I think, we were talking about friendships, and to me, it's all in the family of love. And I do find that there is a transformational power of not just loving, but being loved as well, in that it resets everything that you expect from the world. And I see it in a very micro way with my kids sometimes, that if I'm trying to say the same thing but express through love, which is, you're so caring about these things usually, then why, you're so caring towards your sister, just phrased with the expectation, just phrased within love, the outcome is so different that you do feel like that there is transformational power in it. And I think the experience of being deeply loved does that, which is, it makes you, I don't know, it maybe makes you rest in your own abilities more comfortably. But the thing that it also does then is that it makes very little else measure up, your standards get reset. Yeah, and I think, when you're talking about the resume, it's those aspects of for yourself as well. But then when you think of how none of that goes on another person's resume, right? Like that it'll never be seen or never noted that someone else could have lifted you up so much. None of these feel like individual achievements, right? They and it's not just literally that. So it isn't literally that somebody else watched my, and I'm not short of love. I have the way she watched my children, I'm so fully supported by my husband, for instance, or I always have been by my parents. So it's not just the literal support, but I think there is something that being solidly deeply loved does to you, maybe even professionally. Maybe even that it gives you purpose, maybe that it makes everything come together, maybe it makes you feel confident and entitled in what you're doing and not like an imposter, because everything comes from a more real and grounded place.
What are the things you are more intentional about, and do you think that you can be more intentional about loving?
I do, and I feel it is a practice, and I practice it as a practice. I feel it most specifically when it comes to my kids, but I also feel it in friendships. I feel it with my mother as well, that these are not things to be taken lightly. They're not things to be thrown away. They're not to be taken. They need work. They need expression. And I think to feel entitled to someone's love and to feel endlessly secure of it is not just a foundation for greatness, for happiness. It's a foundation for greatness as well, because it really does liberate you from so much self-doubt and insecurity. So to be able to give that to someone else, where they can just rest in someone's love, I do try to. Yeah, you do feel like you fall short all the time, but at least it's something I try to think about.
Let's end the episode on the customary note. I'll ask you for recommendations of books, films, music that you've been into for the last 4 years since we last met, or whatever. I mean, stuff that you love and you'd love to share with all of us.
So the book that I want everybody to read is Shyam Selvathurai's Many Roads to Paradise. I also love everything Shyam Selvathurai's has written. I also love a series of slightly old-fashioned, very classic novels from Sri Lanka by the writer Martin Wickramasinghe. They are so old-fashioned and so different from India, and not at all part of the Sri Lankan oeuvre that is usually talked about. But they are also universal in a way. So they remind me of everything from Pride and Prejudice to, what is that, something Chauhan, the Indian writer.
Shona Singh?
No.
Oh, Anuja.
Anuja Chauhan. I
Anuja.
love Anuja Chauhan. So it's that stuff. It's that generational angst. So Martin Wickramasinghe's series of books. So those are my big recommendations. And in terms of movies, well, these are not very new, but one of them, maybe my favorite movie in the last few years, I don't know if you watched it, is a Malayalam movie by that stars Mammootty and Jyotika called Kadal, which means love. It's on, I think, Prime or something. In which Mammootty plays a gay man. Absolutely fantastic movie. I love that. In terms of music, currently I love Olivia Dean. Those are mine.
Your Spotify music age you mentioned in the break is 22. Mine is 70. There's 48 years between us, and
my age of 22 is driven by my abiding love for A.R. Rahman of the 2010s.
So Rukmini, thank you so much for being on the show again. It's such a pleasure. I'm sure we'll do more episodes. I don't know if one of them will actually be the... so 26th January 2051, we have to release an episode. So
we'll walk doddering up to...
why doddering? We could be healthier than we are today, given
Let's do it. Let's run on the beach.
Yeah, we should run on the beach and record. That'll be the end. Then the waves come at the end of the episode and sweep us away. Thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. You can follow Rukmini on Twitter at Rukmini. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.